Hello, everybody. Welcome to the RPA Vanguard channel. My name is Andy Menon. In this video, we are going to up our game a little by building a UI-based feedback loop between a UiPath app and a UiPath automation. Let's get started. This idea came to me as a result of a question that was posted to one of the WhatsApp groups that I'm a part of. Fundamentally, someone was looking for a solution in which the status of a process could be continuously updated on a UiPath app interface based on the state of that associated process or automation. I am not sure if we really have this capability to make recursive updates to a UiPath app. And therefore, I came up with one method of how we could do this. But first, let's see what I mean when I say a UI-based feedback loop. So we have a predetermined UiPath automation that's already been deployed to the instance of the orchestrator where this app is also built, right? And that automation is already visible in the UiPath assistant, right? That's pretty standard operating procedure, right? And then in the UiPath app, we pull that automation in, and that automation is available to this app to trigger and also communicate information from the app to the automation, and then from the automation back into the app, right? And the way to do that is to use the start process rule, right? Basically, you call the start process rule, you then select the app, and then you select all the inputs and outputs. And then once the app triggers the automation is triggered, and you would see it running in the UiPath assistant. And once that app has completed execution, right, the status is actually communicated back to the UiPath app, right? And you usually do that in the when started and when completed handlers, right? Here, when the app is completed, you set all the statuses if the app has successfully completed. But if the app has failed, right, you set it in the error event handler, right? You have a two-way communication from the UiPath app to the automation, and from the automation back to the UiPath app. That's good. But here's the problem. We do not have a recursive way of doing it or a repeatable way of doing it. As far as I know, I don't know if there is something in the apps that will allow us to do that. But as far as I know, I cannot repeatedly invoke the start process rule for the communication from the UiPath app to the automation, and from the automation back to the app to take place in a continuous manner, right? So how do we achieve that, right? How do we get to do that? Well, that's what we are going to be talking about in this video, because that's the whole point of why I am making this video, because I've come up with one solution on how to do it. Maybe there are other solutions, but what I'm going to demonstrate and walk you through is just one way of how we can achieve that. So here's the demo that I've come up with to demonstrate the concept of the UI-based feedback loop between the UiPath app to the UiPath automation, right? Here you can see that the predefined app has already been deployed to the same orchestrator instance as this app, right? Now, what the app user is going to do is going to initiate the loop by clicking on the do work button, right? And the do work button has the start process rule that you saw in the previous section. And what it does is it invokes this automation, right? And this automation is basically a bare bones shell. It just simulates some work, right? And that work is basically a pause, right? It pauses for 5 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever the time you set in, from this drop-down box, right? So what happens is that the do work button is clicked, the app calls out to this automation, this automation performs the work, the simulated work, and then a very interesting thing happens after the app has completed execution. As you saw in the previous section, the automation communicates back to the app internally, like you saw in the start process rule, right? But here, what we are going to do is we are going to push the boundaries a little bit, right? What the automation is going to do is once it has completed successfully, it is going to reanimate this app through its user interface. Very important. That's why I call this a UI-based feedback loop. So the automation animates this app by updating the item number, and then it clicks on the do work button, right? And that is why this loop will continue. And as a result, what happens is the app has called the automation, right? The automation completes execution, right? The automation calls the app that instantiated it by animating the UI, and the whole process repeats over and over, forming a UI-based feedback loop between the UiPath app and the UiPath automation, right? So what we have done in essence is basically, in addition to the internal communication of data and information between the app and the automation, we have also added an element of UI-based communication or UI-based interaction between the automation and the app, right? So with that, let me start this demo. So when I click the do work button, right, the item number that's going to be passed to the automation will be having a value of 1. And then the automation will receive this value of 5 seconds, and it will do some work, or basically pause for 5 seconds. And then you will see that it will keep clicking the do work button, and the value of the item number will keep incrementing, and the status will be updated into this text area box. So here I've applied a limit of 10 items to be processed. But what I'll be doing is I'm going to apply a smaller limit for the purposes of the demo. I'm going to make it, say, 3. And then I'm going to reduce the size of this window a little bit because we want to see both these things in action. And I'm going to trigger the do work loop. So this shade of green here indicates that the work is in progress and the app has triggered the automation. And just to show you or prove the fact that the automation is actually running the app, I'm going to park my mouse pointer here, and I'm not going to move it, right? The reason I'm drawing your attention to that is because this automation has been designed to run this app or animate this app in background processing mode, basically using simulate type and simulate click, right? And now you see what happened is the app executed and the automation ran once, and then it updated the value back to the text area box and also the item number, right? And then it clicked the do work button again, right? And because I've applied a limit of 3 items, this loop is going to stop once 3 items have been processed. So it looks like the execution has completed, the loop has stopped, and that is because I have applied the limit of 3 items here. And here you can see the update. The app has processed 3 items, right? And then once it stepped into the fourth item, it stopped processing and the loop broke. And then the automation sent the status back to the app, right? So this is one way of breaking that loop, because if you don't have this mechanism in there, then this will become an endless loop, right? A forever loop. The first test, we stopped the app by applying a limit. In the second test, we are going to intervene and we are going to stop this process manually, right? So to begin this test, I'm going to reset the user interface of the app, and I'm back to where I started. And this time I'm going to leave it at 10, right? And I'm not going to check this button because I have not yet decided to stop this app. It doesn't make any sense, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit do work, and I'm going to park my mouse pointer here and allow this whole loop to run again. Okay, so after running this loop, I realized that I did not apply the proper limit, right? So now I decide to stop the process by manually intervening and breaking the loop, right? So now I move my mouse pointer and I'm going to click the stop process checkbox. And there you go. Here you can see that the update is different, right? It says that the process has been stopped by the user. Also, one of the things that you have to note is the problem with intervening and stopping the process manually is you really do not know what's the exact item number the app has passed to the automation, and at what point the automation is executing, right? So what happens is you might kind of process an extra item before the app or the automation breaks the loop, right? So this is one of the disadvantages of manually intervening to stop the loop. And I think that if we add a processing item limit, right, on using this text box, I think that's a surefire way of stopping the automation from forever running the app and breaking the loop in a much more reliable manner, right? But this is just a concept. It shows one of the two ways in which this UI-based automation loop can be broken, right? Now, when we stop the app, you get to see some of the stats on the right. And here you can see that I started this demo somewhere around 9:35, and the app has been running since then. And this is the current time, right? So it's 21:35 and 21:38. That is about 3 minutes, right? Which is 180 seconds plus another 27 seconds is a 207 seconds, right? Basically, that's how long this app took, or this loop took, to process the information passed by the app into the automation and back. And the number of items that were processed is 6. And we are back in UiPath Studio. And this is the automation that you saw in action in the previous section. This is named App to Automation Advanced Feedback Loop. And this is a flow, and it's pretty simple. So basically, it has a bunch of arguments that are both input and also output. Obviously, the input arguments are fed in from the app, and the output arguments are used to, to send the information back from this automation back to the app, right? So here are the arguments. It's the item number, the simulate work in seconds. Basically, how long do you want the app to simulate some work, right? It's a value in seconds. And if you're applying a stop limit, right, how many items do you want to process before the app can stop? And then this is the Boolean value. If the user has checked the stop app checkbox, then that value gets passed in here. Otherwise, it's default set to false. And then the other thing is the app title. Now, the reason I gave this as an input parameter is because I've changed the title of the app a couple of times, and then I found my automation to be not working because it cannot find the page with that title. So here, the title of this app here is passed in as a parameter to this automation so that it can find the right window. So this is the app start time, and you can see that I've changed the convention a little bit. It's all in caps. The reason for that is once the app starts running, the start time does not change, right? What changes is the current time and the time elapsed since the start time. So basically, this value is simply passed in each time the automation calls the app, and the app triggers the automation, right? So you can see how quirky it is, but nonetheless, it works, right? So these are the input arguments. The output arguments are basically what is the status, right? And that output status is what you see is being updated in this text area box, right? Basically, as each item is processed, that output is appended to this text area box, and that is listed here for us to see what the status of this feedback loop is, right? That is the status. And if in case that the user has stopped the app manually, then you will see this status update. But if the app has ended after processing X number of items, then you will see that the status update is different, and the app will tell you that it stopped after processing the number of items that have been processed based on the value entered in this box, right? That's the output. And then if you look at the number of items processed, the time elapsed since the app started, and the current time, right? These are all the values that are updated to these label controls, right? So the start time is instantiated here on the side of the app, but all of these values come from the automation, right? So here you can see that the start time was 21:35, but then once the automation triggered the first time and processed the first value, it sends back the current time, it sends back the time elapsed, which is the difference between these two time values, and also it sends back the items processed, right? So these are basically the set of output arguments, right? So what happens here is the app receives the inputs, it logs the inputs that it has received so that we can see it in the orchestrator, and then it checks to see if the user has intervened to stop the app, right? Is there a manual stop? Now, if there's no manual stop, it checks to see if there is a stop limit. Now, the stop limit is true if the number of items processed is greater than the limit applied, right? So as long as that is not true, right, what the app will do is, or what the automation will do, sorry, will continue to run, and this flag is set to true, right? But if a stop limit has been applied, then if you look into this sequence, the continue running flag is set to false, and then the output status is set to indicate that the app is stopping after processing the set number of items, right? Pretty simple. if the user has intervened manually, right? Pretty much the same thing happens what you see in the sequence limit stop. There is going to be a different kind of an update. So if I click on this, it's pretty obvious, right? The continue running is false and the output status will be slightly different. And that is what happens when the automation executes each time. First, it's going to check for the stop conditions. And if both stop conditions are not true, then continue running will be set to true. And then that run status will be logged. The continue running will be logged to the orchestrator logs. And then a decision is taken whether we have to keep running, right? If this continue running is set to true, then this is the interesting part. This is where the automation will simulate the work and then reanimate the app. All of that happens in the simulate work sequence, right? So double clicking on this here, you can see that there's a delay, right? It's called a work doppelganger. Basically, it simulates work, right? And based on the value that was passed in from here, right? Every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds, whatever the value might be, right? The automation will simulate some work. So if you are going to be applying this in your real world scenario, then you're going to replace this with your work, right? Basically, whatever it is you're doing, file processing or updating something in a storage bucket or an API call, whatever the case that might be, right? And once the work has been done, the output values will be set. And here you can see the calculations happening in the assign activities, right? Basically, the process output time is set to now, which is the current time. And then the time elapsed is the date difference between the time that was passed in, right? The fixed start time and the current time. And then the next step is when the time is passed out back to the app, it is passed in as a string pre-formatted to the US format, right? And then finally, you have the out item status, which is basically the update that you see on the text area box, right? Now the automation has internally communicated to the app, right? Basically, it has decided what values it's going to send back to the app. Now it has to instantiate the next run of the loop, right? And this is where we have the UI-based automation part of it, right? So what the app does is it reanimates the app that called it. And all of that is in this single sequence. Basically, it attaches itself to the Edge browser, right? And the selector is based on the, if I go into the selector here, it is based on the app title that has been passed in from the app, right? So that it can, so that this automation can find the app each time, right? And then it looks for the item number, right? Using an anchor. Please do note that you might need anchors to find your selectors reliably, because these controls may not have specific names, right? When the app is rendered in the browser. So I have used anchor-based selectors to reliably find the item number and then update the item number, right? So now what happens here is an update is performed to this item number value, right? And that value is current item value plus 1. So if the incoming value that has been processed is 1, the next item to be processed is 2, right? And that is updated to this field here, right? And the next step is to click the do work button, right? And here, the automation reanimates the app by clicking on the do work button, right? And one other thing that I had mentioned is when I ran these demos, I took my mouse pointer and parked it to the side of the screen, right? And that's basically because the automation is designed to run or animate the app using a background service mode, basically, if you lock your screen, it should still work, right? And so if I click on this activity here, you will see that the simulate click is set to true. Similarly, if you look at this, the simulate type is set to true. You might ask me, how did you figure out, how did you put that action to animate the app if you did not build the app first, right? It's basically like the chicken and egg story, right? What came first? So one of the things that you have to understand is you got to build these side by side, right? Not one after the other, right? Because you will need, the app will need to know what automation it is supposed to trigger and what parameters it's supposed to pass in and out. And then the automation will need to know what app it must reanimate, right? So please make sure that when you are doing this from scratch, try to develop this side by side. So what I did was I built a skeleton of the app, right? And I made sure my UI elements are all fixed. Basically, what I did is I built this UI. I made sure that all of these elements are fixed and I know what I'm going to do. And I also made sure what my inputs and outputs are, right? And once I fixed the UI, I came back to Studio. I built this app, and then I built the sequence that is going to click on the do work button, right? And then once I knew that everything is going to work the way I expected, I deployed this automation to the orchestrator, right? So once I did that, I jumped back into the Studio, and then I finished the rest of the app. So once you have already deployed your automation, the next thing for you to do is to come back to the app and finish the rest of the work, right? Rest of the integration work. So by this time, you must be pretty familiar with how to pull this app, because this is one of the fundamental features of apps and one of the fundamental reasons why apps exist. So you must already be aware of it by now. So once you have pulled this app in, if you, or the automation in, sorry, you will be able to see the inputs and outputs right here. So that will give you a pretty good sense of what are the inputs and outputs that need to be passed between the app and the automation, right? The next step for us is basically to go back to the main page and add the logic for the do work button. This is very important, right? This is the most important thing that you need to do. And when you click on the do work and get into the events of the do work button, and I get into edit rule, and here we call this start process rule. This is something that we saw at the beginning of this video, right? So one of the things that you have to remember, please set this to unattended, right? If you set this to attended, right, what happens is the automation will fail on the second run because only one instance of the foreground process can run. So even if you are running it in open screen mode, right, please make sure that you're set it to unattended, right? That's one thing that you have to remember. And then we pass the values from the app into the automation. And then just as we passed in the input parameters, we populate the when started event handler. So when the app starts, we have the various values of app variables set to their required status, right? I'm not going to go into detail. This is pretty straightforward. And what this does is basically shows the green and red banner at the bottom of the app, just to show you that when the automation is running, the banner turns green, and when the automation has stopped running, the banner turns red, right? And then when completed, this means it is completed successfully. All the outputs are populated into app variables from the output variables of the automation, right? Basically, if you click on this, there is a fixed variable called line break that is used to break the lines. And if you are not familiar with the concept of line breaks, please watch the previous video on how to use line breaks in UiPath apps. And what basically happens is this status update here on this app, right, is populated, right? And here you can see that there are line breaks. Similarly, if you go down to the rest of that event handler, you will see that the process current time is updated. That is returned by the automation. Similarly, the process elapsed seconds has also been returned by the automation, so on and so forth, right? And this is how we feed back all the output data from the automation back to the app. Now, if in case the automation fails, then we have the error section, right? Basically, you populate this var app status with the error that has been reported, right? And then just to indicate that there is something wrong, the background color of that banner that you saw at the bottom of the screen is changed back to red, right? Now, the last section that you might want to see is the app load event, right? So if I go back to the main page of this app and go into the loaded handler here in edit room, here you can see that we are instantiating the various app variables to their default status, right? And here is the color code for green, and then there is the color code for red. And then here is the app startup date time. And then what we do is we instantiate the date time to now, and then we convert it into US format by using the string function, the concat function, and then using all the date functions that are available. But one thing to note here is there is no seconds for a time value. So what I have done here is instantiate or initialize the seconds value to 0, right? You can use 59 if you want to, based on how you want to put it. And then the current time is set to empty string because that is returned by the automation back to the app. Similarly, all other variables that are used for input output are set to their default values, right? And here is the work simulator time. It's by default set to 5. So that is what you see here, right? The selected value is by default 5, and that is bound to the drop-down box. And then here is the line break, right? This is a constant. The other part that you might want to see is the reset part of it, right? When we go to the reset label, and then we click on the reset, so basically what happens here is when I'm ready to run this once more, I click the reset button, and all of this just disappears in the form resets. And just to bring this demo to a logical conclusion, I am going to hit the reset button, and the app is restored back to default status. So I hope you have got an idea of how to set up a recursive channel of communication between a UiPath app and its companion automation in order to perform frequent and recursive updates to a UiPath app. I'm sharing this basic framework with you, and I'm hoping that the community will take this to the next level by applying it in the real world scenario. I would be really interested to see what you folk come up with. But that's all for this video, and I'm hoping that you liked what you learned from this episode. Please do like and subscribe to the RPA Vanguard channel. I'll truly appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll see you soon. Bye.